The time has come for Scorpio 2019, the latest video in my Bootcamp for Saints video series, where I work through each section of the Gospel of Mark as it tracks the signs of the Zodiac. Welcome. And as you'll see in this video, this playlist is well named. Now, this is a massively important video that has ramifications far beyond anything even I anticipated. Now, the topic of this section alone is a bombshell, that Jesus marries another man. You know him as Lazarus in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of Mark, he's simply known as the rich young man. He's also known that way in Matthew and Luke. So, question, how do we know he's young? Because the Gospel of Mark, as we received it, doesn't tell us that. And Matthew and Luke got their story from Mark. It's Matthew that tells us that. So how does Matthew know? Well, he would since he was there, and it's important that you know that this is a young man. So that might be why, and that's entirely possible and acceptable. But there's another possibility that's just as likely. I'm going to have to go to the Greek to look at it, and I can't wait to show you. And don't worry, it's not going to be hard. Now, I've been insisting for quite a while that Jesus married Lazarus after he resurrected from the dead. And as I said in my Libra video, my previous video, every single time I have an opportunity to prove that it's wrong, and I always try to prove that it's wrong, the case is stronger than ever. Nothing has changed. Now, it's important to understand what I am not telling you. It's as important as to understand what I am telling you. I am not saying Jesus is a homosexual. Jesus is God. I am saying that he manifested as a man and he married another man when he just as easily could have married a woman or not got married at all, which is what everybody thinks, what I thought up to recently. So we're obligated to ask, why? Is he telling us something about our ultimate fate that we need to know? I would guess yes. And there's an interesting side question. The fact that Jesus married another man, what should that tell us about Kabbalah, the so-called Jewish mysticism? Does it tell us anything? We'll see that it does indeed. It's a body blow to Kabbalah, as well as a bolt out of the blue. It's a body blow to Kabbalah and all the other mystical systems on which it was clearly based when it was invented in 13th century medieval Spain. In fact, it falls right in line with one of the prime features of Christianity that struck C.S. Lewis, the famous English Christian writer, as an especially telling signal of authenticity. It takes us places that we would never in a million years have guessed we needed to go. It's the Kabbalists and the other mystics who are rampaging boars. And I'm going to kill a third bird with one stone. There's been an accusation leveled against Christianity for decades, if not centuries, that we plagiarized a Roman mystery religion called Mithraism. Now, in this video, I'm going to show you that Mark was well aware of Mithraism, and in fact, in a surprising way, he embraced it. That's another one of those bolts out of the blue that I'm sure C.S. Lewis would have appreciated, and still does, since he's in heaven right now, I assume. But Mark wasn't slavishly emulating them. He was building on their work. And it's the same for the four evangelists together. They did the same thing with Greco-Roman biography. They embraced it and extended it. I talk about how well they did that in my Libra video. In fact, I split that section off to a separate video that I call, Yes, You Can Trust the Gospels. All the videos I mentioned in the video here are linked below. Mark uses this very subtle example of Roman social technology, that's a cult of Mithras, to demonstrate to the world that Jesus Christ is the Lord of all creation. And he did a fantastic job. In fact, it might be too much of a good thing. Thankfully, Matthew and Luke swept in to clear up any potential misunderstandings. I'll show you. But of course, that didn't keep people from misunderstanding. So, let's get to work. Again, we track our night sky. This is Scorpio. There are 3 deacons of Scorpio, and 2 of them are attached to each other. The serpent handler, called Ophiuchus here, and we have a serpent. And we have Hercules. Here is a beautiful rendering of the signs of the Zodiac and their deacons. You will notice there are 2 men. Hercules, of course, is half god and half man. He's renowned for having both male and female lovers. Here he looks like he's hanging down from heaven to kiss the serpent handler, the other man. This is a perfect image to have for our Scorpio section. Now, until I saw this rendering, I didn't know there was a serpent lurking at the very tippy top of the night sky, Draco. That's a revelation for me. And here's another revelation. Hercules, or why don't we just call him Jesus today, is grinding Draco's skull beneath his heel.
right out of Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. Now, the most ancient Greeks believed the serpent handler, whom Hercules is about to kiss, was Apollo battling Python. I've no doubt they got that from the Minoans on Crete, which brings me back to the Festus disc on side B, which I've demonstrated is dedicated to the Minoan sun god. There's a snake head dead center. You can even see its little tongue. Maybe that's Draco at the top of the sky, or the serpent Python defeated by Apollo. Could work either way. But the serpent handler has also been called Laocoon, dragged into Hades by serpents along with his sons when he tried to warn the Trojans about the Trojan horse. That scenario works for him even in our Christian story, Lazarus saved from Hades by his lover, Jesus. But he's also been seen as Asclepius, the divine doctor. Hail, great physician of the world, all hail. Hail, mighty infant, who in years to come shall heal the nations and defraud the tomb. Swift be thy growth, thy triumphs unconfined. Make kingdoms thicker and increase mankind. Thy daring art shall animate the dead and draw the thunder on thy guilty head. For thou shalt rise, but from the dark abode rise up victorious and be twice a god. So you could also say it's a second Jesus. The drawing down of the thunder refers to the fact that Zeus struck Asclepius dead for raising the dead, just as God allowed his son to be struck dead by man to save us from death. Which reminds me of what I call the gay rapture, a Q source saying from Jesus, preserved in the Gospel of Luke. Matthew has also preserved some of it, although he dramatically altered it. Someone else had noticed this passage and walked me through it on the internet. Someone else centuries ago also noticed this passage and rewrote some of it, although I'm not going to talk about that here. The frame for this is Zeus and his lover and cupbearer, Ganymede. Within the frame are allusions to the sons of God from Genesis 6 and Sodom and Gomorrah, followed by two gay couples, one male and one female. It's part of a larger pro-gay thread winding through Luke that I will cover later. I was flattered, obviously, but I thought it was strange. Why would Luke be pro-gay? Was he just being nice?
And now, of course, I know. Jesus was married to another man. Again, not to be confused with being a homosexual. Jesus was God. Now, there's something else I'd like to note here. I've discovered a new translation of the New Testament, and I'm going to be relying on it a lot from here on out.
The source, New Testament, with extensive notes on Greek word meanings by Dr. A. Nyland. From the description on the back, her research field is Greek lexicography, from Homeric to Hellenistic times. She has published academic papers in the fields of both Hittite and Greek lexicography. And after years of doing that, she says, hey, we need to retranslate this Bible because there are a lot of words that don't mean what you think they mean. And she would know. So her extensive notes on the actual language are going to be very useful in the future and will be very useful here as well. And now, let's read our Scorpio section. They were on the road, going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him, and flog him, and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again. This is a warning Jesus gave his disciples several times, and this would become the most primitive statement of the Christian faith afterward. This is exactly what Paul repeats to his readers in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4. And it's after this that we have our secret mark. So let us continue reading our Bible. And they come to Bethany, and there was there a certain woman whose brother of hers had died. And yes, that's the way the Greek looks. Mark had a very odd way of doing things, and this section matches in with Mark's way of writing perfectly. This book right here, Mark's Other Gospel, is based on Dr. Brown's PhD dissertation. He walks through all that. And coming, she prostrated before Jesus and says to him, Son of David, have mercy on me. This is the first time Jesus is called Son of David, and he will be called that again in the Scorpio section later. Now, if you didn't see my video on Libra, I will tell you that a brother called Jesus God, indirectly, but nevertheless, as Jesus pointed out, he certainly did.
And that will be important because the third and last time we hear about a son of David in this gospel is 1335. There, Jesus points out that David called the Messiah his Lord. But how can he call his son Lord? Now, a lot of people, including Reverend Darlison, thinks this proves that Jesus is denying that he's a son of David. But that's silly. They just call him the son of David, and he doesn't deny it. He's going to be called the son of David twice in this section, and he doesn't deny it there either. Jesus is God, but of the flesh, he's a son of David. Every Christian understands that. Also, David had Jonathan. Now, as I've demonstrated in other videos, the motif of male warrior lovers is Amorite. And according to the book of Ezekiel, the Israelites are part Amorite. And it was the Amorite rulers of Babylon who wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, to put that together, they had taken old stories of King Gilgamesh and his beloved servant, Enkidu, and they rewrote them so that they became lovers. Now, in Mark's version of the Transfiguration that I talk about in my Leo video, obviously linked below, Jesus is portrayed as the new Gilgamesh. Now, that will be important to understand this very section. Now, by calling Jesus a son of David, Mark is cueing us in. He's reminding us that Jesus is about to do something that neither David nor the demigod Gilgamesh could. He's going to raise his lover from the dead. And by the way, whenever I think about Gilgamesh, I think about Hercules. Gilgamesh is obviously the ultimate literary source for Hercules. You even see them both wearing lion skins, which of course brings us back to Scorpio and its deacons. Let us continue.
But the disciples rebuked her, and having become angry, Jesus went away with her into the garden where the tomb was. And immediately was heard from the tomb a great cry. Some read this to mean the young man cried out, betraying the fact that this was not actually a resurrection, but some kind of ritual. If you don't know about Gilgamesh, I can see why you might think that, but it's there, although not in the later Amorite epic. It's in an earlier Sumerian poem, but that poem was a favorite in the Amorite scribal schools of Nippur and Ur. I'll talk about that very soon, and you'll see why it's a favorite. It's a very striking poem. Or if you read it, I'm not going to read it. In approaching, Jesus rolled the stone from the door of the tomb, and going in immediately where the young man was, he stretched out the hand and raised him, having grasped the hand. This very weird, odd construction that's very marked, very much like what you see in Mark. But the young man, having looked upon him, loved him, and began to beg him that he might be with him. And going out from the tomb, they went into the house of the young man, for he was rich. And after 6 days, Jesus gave charge to him. So there are 6 days, and then on the 7th this happens, just like creation. Now, virtually everyone who agrees this passage is authentic tries to play this off as some kind of religious ritual. I know of no ritual ever in the history of Christendom that looks anything like this except for a wedding. And I would point out that Jewish weddings lasted 7 days. And when it was evening, the young man comes to him, donning a linen sheet upon his naked body. This is the dress not just of marriage, but of death and resurrection. So it's not a surprise this young man would come back when Jesus is about to be murdered, dressed exactly like this. It's also not a coincidence the young man would be sitting in a tomb, in Jesus' tomb, after the resurrection, wearing white, just like this, and probably with naked body underneath the white. And he remained with him that night, for Jesus was teaching him the mystery of the kingdom of God. Now rising, he returned from there to the other side of the Jordan. Rising from what? Rising from bed. This was his wedding night, which brings us to the death of Enkidu. Jesus is the new Adam, and he's the new David, and he's the new Gilgamesh, and they all have a common theme. Jesus redeems us from death when they famously could not. Hear me, O young men, hear me. Hear me, O elders of teeming Uruk, hear me. I shall weep for Enkidu, my friend, like a hired mourner woman I shall bitterly wail. The axe at my side, in which my arm trusted, the dirk at my belt, the shield at my face, my festive garment, my girdle of delight. There's your garment. A wicked wind rose up and robbed me. He covered like a bride. The face of his friend. Like an eagle he circled around him. Like a lioness deprived of her cubs, he paced to and fro, this way and that. Now let's see who cried out in the tomb. Bilgames in the netherworld, or as they called it, in those days, in those far-off days. I love the way they wrote. They would like go in and back out and go back in, but a little deeper. If Enkidu is to avoid fatal consequences in the presence of the shades of the dead, he must show proper respect for them. He should behave as if at a funeral, acting with sensitivity and not drawing attention to himself, which of course he did. There in the netherworld he will come upon the awful spectacle of Ereshkigal herself, who lies in prostrate in perpetual mourning for her son Ninazu. The clothes torn from her body, she rakes her flesh with her nails and pulls out her hair. Ancient funerals included a lot of wailing and crying out. As you just saw, they even hired out public mourners if they could. The name, Ninazu, literally means Lord Doctor, and he was known for healing, but he was mostly associated with the underworld and serpents. So there's your Asclepius figure again, who of course was also struck dead by Zeus. I'm going to talk about a story in Zeus where I think Ninazu shows up again. In fact, this connection makes me pretty sure we'll be looking at Luke's disguised version of Secret Mark. Some people think that Secret Mark is forgery coming from Luke. No, it's clearly coming the other way, if there is in fact such a connection. So let's go back to our received Gospel of Mark where we left off earlier. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Isn't that two men?" Of course, just like Hercules and the serpent handler, and just like Jesus and the young man. Zebedee means thunder, so they are the sons of thunder, bringing to mind Zeus, who'd slain Asclepius with lightning, and who kidnapped Ganymede to make him his divine lover. Don't forget our gay rapture. "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." Now, back to the Zodiac. Scorpio's tail displays a double influence from his forked rays. For when that first appears, the peaceful child shall cities raise, and be inclined to build. The world shall see him with his plow surround the place designed and mark the fatal bound. Or he shall waste what other pains did raise, where populous cities stood, where their beasts shall graze, or harvest grow. He leads to the extremes, and power agreeing waits upon his beams. Menelaus. A very nice fit. Scorpio's about power. The sons of thunder are requesting power. Menelaus was a very near contemporary of Jesus, certainly within 50 years, so the idea he expresses here would have been well known. Jesus agrees. You get all the power you want, but in the kingdom of heaven there are expectations. When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all." Amen. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. And now our final bit of the Scorpio section. Without Secret Mark, it only gets 20 verses, tied for dead last with Virgo. Now it's filling out nicely. This part in red is also from Mark. They came to Jericho, and there was there the sister of the young man whom Jesus loved, and his mother and Salome. And Jesus did not receive them. And as he and disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, notice that without this section, the only thing the Gospels tell us is they entered and left Jericho without doing anything. Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." So Timaeus calls Jesus son of David twice, and Jesus does not correct him. Take the hint. And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way.
This is not secret Mark. Everybody knows this belongs in the Bible. He's been called the son of David, and he doesn't deny it. So, now that that's happened, and now that he's God and he's been called God and he doesn't deny that either, that begs a question. How can God be the son of David? So Jesus asked the question. Remember, at this stage, he's not even admitting he's the Messiah. What makes you think he's going to tell people he's the son of God? As for his divinity, writers have a saying, don't say it, show it. Now back in Leo, we looked at the transfiguration of Jesus where we see his true face. It's not the face of a holy man or a prophet, it's the face of a God. And since we're talking about Jews here, it's the face of the only true God. Now, in the Scorpio section, we start out by talking about death and resurrection. Then we move into a resurrection and a wedding bed, his marriage to another man. Now, all of this fits perfectly into Scorpio.
Mythologically, the sign is associated with the underworld. Big surprise. The place of the dead, Sheol, the tomb to which we go, and the womb from which we come. It symbolizes the profound mystery of life and death which eludes all ratiocination. Just the thinking that only occurs in your head, not just your heart and in your gut. And so has come to symbolize rebirth, resurrection. Again, big surprise. The ancient northern peoples celebrated their festivals of death at this time of year, and these linger still in Halloween and in their Christian counterparts, All Souls Day and All Saints Day. November, the Scorpio month, is, in Catholicism, the month of the Holy Souls, when Catholics are encouraged to pray for the dead, which I highly recommend. It is supposedly the time when the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead is at its thinnest. To the Jews, Scorpio was also represented by the eagle, which was thought to be capable of renewing its youth, Psalm 103:5, which is what we see, by the way, in the Epic of Gilgamesh as well, and which symbolizes the power within man to rise above the temptation of his lower nature. Scorpio writers like Robert Louis Stevenson, Albert Camus, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Sylvia Plath seem particularly concerned to explore the lower nature of the human being, but always with the realization that evil and darkness have to be redeemed and not simply censored or legislated away. It's true psychologically as well. You'll see. Redemption through suffering, personal or vicarious, is a consistent theme of Scorpio writers of both literature and theology. Sexuality, generation, death, and regeneration are obviously part of this matrix of associations, and it is interesting that the ancient world perceived a connection between sexuality, power, and death, which has taken depth psychology to rediscover. You'll see that. I'm going to show you how it was like in the ancient world. In Shakespeare's time, the orgasm was called a little death. I thought that was Freud, actually. And today, feminists are telling us that many sex acts have more to do with power and domination than with pleasure. Whatever. Don't you wish, oh girl? And now we talk about Mars, which ruled Scorpio at the time. Today it's ruled by Pluto, although no one knows if that's true, since I don't know if that's true, since Pluto's not considered a planet anymore. But these people knew nothing about Pluto anyway, so it doesn't matter. Ptolemy, the old man himself, tells us that Mars rules the genitals, and that it assumes command of manhood for the space of 15 years. He introduces severity and misery into life, and implants cares and troubles in the soul and in the body, giving it, as it were, some sense and notion of passing its prime and urging it, before it approaches its end, by labor to accomplish something among its undertakings that is worthy of note, which is what I'm trying to do here. I'm actually going to visually confirm the connection between Scorpio and sexuality and death before the end of this video. Not just Mars, Scorpio. And one last thing before we go. The transfiguration of Jesus, which we cover in the Leo section, is almost certainly at Mount Hermon on top, the highest point in Israel. There, Jesus' garment was said to be so dazzlingly white that no launderer could clean them properly. This is where I first realized that Jesus was the new Gilgamesh. In the Babylonian epic, Gilgamesh wore clothes that never needed to be cleaned after he emerged from the underworld. But the Scorpio section happens near the Dead Sea, the lowest point on earth. Quite the contrast. There again, as I've said, Jesus is revealed as the new Gilgamesh, but a Gilgamesh who succeeded in saving his lover from the clutches of death. Now we compare our passage from Libra, where Jesus meets his husband for the first time, with our newly recovered Scorpio passage, the so-called secret Mark. And now is the time to answer the question, how do we know this rich man is a rich young man? Because as Dr. Nyland points out, the Gospel of Mark, as we've received it, does not tell us that. Matthew does. So let's look at our Greek. Here they are side by side, and we're going to highlight the English words for youth because they're different words in Greek. Now, in a footnote for the regular Mark, this is the New Revised Standard Version, Dr. Nolan points out that the rich man has kept all these commandments since he was a young man. They're using her words, implying that he is no longer a young man. But he doesn't say young man. He says from his neotitos, his youth, or if you must be literal, from his newness, the Greek neo. Paul of Tarsus uses the exact same word in the exact same context in Acts 26, 4 through 5. All the Jews know my way of life from my youth, a time spent from the beginning among my own people and in Jerusalem. They have known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that I have belonged to the strictest sect of our religion and lived as a Pharisee. So, if coming from a Greek, this might mean young man, but whether this is coming from a Greek-speaking Jew from 2,000 years ago or an observant English-speaking Jew today, they're both telling me they've been following the commandments since they were old enough to be held morally responsible to follow the commandments. The bar mitzvah, literally son of the commandments, that's 13. So while I would disagree this text rules him out as being a young man, I would suggest it gives you an idea of how old this man was at least. So if he's, say, 14 years old, then this wouldn't mean much. But if he's in his mid to late 20s or even his 30s, then that would be a meaningful chunk of time. Nevertheless, she is half right. He could be 80 years old from what we're seeing so far. Outside of Matthew, only Secret Mark tells us this is a young man, neoniskos, a grown man who has nevertheless not hit 40 yet. That's typically when a man acquires, or at least starts to acquire, his own true center of gravity. I can actually tell you exactly when that happened to me. I was 44 years old when I finally turned the corner. Well, what can I say? Some of us are late bloomers. And this is the exact word Matthew uses in verses 20 and 22. Now, how did he know that? Maybe to clarify something about the man that wasn't revealed in Mark or Luke, if you assume Secret Mark doesn't belong to it, or what is just as likely, and I would say even more so, the man who had compiled the Gospel of Matthew simply carried it over from Secret Mark. So far in this video series, I've given you plenty of evidence that Matthew drew from a longer version of Mark than Luke did. I don't see why this example should be any different.
In sum, the only reason why we know this man is under 40 is because Secret Mark told us. And I'd also like to point out that Jesus picked a man appropriate both in age and temperament to be his husband, even by modern standards, which the same could be said for Muhammad. Now, I'm going to show you how the two stories were written by design to point to each other.
He sets out on a journey. He finishes a journey. A man ran up and knelt before him. A certain woman, coming, prostrated herself before Jesus. The young man calls him God. Jesus does not deny that. He just points that out. For the first time ever in Mark, Jesus is called the Son of David. Nice parallel, yes? Together, these two passages very elegantly take us up to the question. Jesus looks upon the young man and loves him, tells the young man to follow him. The young man looks upon him and loves him, beseeches Jesus that he might remain with him. Now, both Reverend Darlison and Dr. Nyland translates this to mean Jesus warms up to him, very different from falling in love with him. But it's the same word Secret Mark uses, agapesen. To say that the young man is simply warming up to Jesus here is missing the boat completely. Mark is clearly playing with the Greek, although I'm not competent enough at all in the language to determine exactly what he's up to. Maybe the word meant something like warming up, but Mark rolled it into his resurrection story and amplified it. Jesus comments that this man is just missing the kingdom of God. In Secret Mark, the young man receives it in all of its intimate glory.
And now for my big unveil. There seems to be a rumor going around the internet and in some books that Jesus is a fictional character, created as a stand-in for the sun god. There seems to be an especially strong correlation with Mithras. Now, if all we had was the Gospel of Mark, that would be an understandable mistake, but it isn't. So, two questions. Which Jesus? Matthew's, Mark's, or Luke's? And then also, which Mithras? The Roman Mithras of the mystery schools or the Mithra of Persia? Because scholars do not agree at all that they are the same deity, even though a lot of people on the internet do. Although in all fairness, they go back and forth on this. They moved from absolutely to no way, and now they're back to absolutely, although apparently with caveats. I've not read any peer-reviewed papers on this, so I'll probably do that later.
We'll start with the first question, surely answered by the revelation of Jesus' divine nature on Mount Hermon during the Transfiguration. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Matthew looks good. In fact, he goes one better. Jesus' face is the sun. Helios, the sun god. His clothing is the sunlight. That's Apollo. He's actually the god of sunlight. That's a distinction the Greeks made, and Matthew was obviously aware of it. Looking good so far. But I already told you who Jesus is in Mark. He's Gilgamesh. And we haven't talked about who he is in Luke's version. He's a thunder god. In fact, Yahweh originally presented himself to the Israelites as a thunder god. Modern scholars, for example, all insist Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are two different creation stories knit together, or they're right about the knitting, but they're wrong about the text. El, or Elohim in Genesis 1, is the sky father. Yahweh is the thunder god. These two chapters are written at the same time by the same person. What is being knit together is the sky father and the thunder god. I go into that in extreme detail in the Leo video. They are two different gods, and yet somehow they are the same God. Does that sound familiar to you? And what is the first thing Genesis chapter 2 tells us? That there was no rain. A reader at the time would have picked up on that detail. That would have told them that there was a thunder god who just hadn't brought the thunder yet. And Jesus actually acts like a thunder god. In all the Gospels, he walks on water, he calms storms. Sun gods do not do that.
Now, as I said earlier, Jesus isn't just showing us he's a nice guy on Mount Hermon, or a sage. He's a god, or at least the son of a god, like Gilgamesh, or Hercules. By switching up the details like this, the evangelists are showing you not to get too attached to the particular mythologium that might be used to color the event. You're supposed to get the bigger point, because at the end of the day, there's only one God, and three persons. Aren't the Gospels fantastic? There's nothing like this in the pagan world. We beat those guys fair and square. Don't let anybody tell you different. So we're going to look at the Roman Mithras first, because as you'll see, that's the one that had the direct influence on Mark and how he organized his gospel. While there are surely some connections between the two versions, in fact, there's no doubt about that, archaeology related to the Roman version shows all the hallmarks of being wholly indigenous. In fact, completely Roman, not even Greek, much less Persian. It first appears in central Italy, and most of its major artifacts are in the Western Empire, with the exception of Syria, where we are called Christian for the first time at Antioch. Huh? Okay. Now, I hasten to add, this could have started in the East, probably modern-day Turkey, and then just caught on in the West.
So why else do we suspect it's indigenous? Because we can tell from the artifacts that the mythology drew heavily from the constellations. You'll be able to see that for yourself. And the Iranian mythology clearly does not. You'll also be able to see that, which is why we're back to our star map. So let's once again draw the course of the sun through the heavens. Mark starts with Aries. Perseus, with his one arm raised, looms over Taurus, the bull of heaven. Except for these Romans, it wasn't Perseus, it was Mithras. And by the way, Perseus is a deacon of Aries. But everyone argues over everything with this cult. All the scholars do. Now, one thinks it's the hunter Orion who carried over into Mithras. But he's crouching, and he's not even carrying the right weapon. And he's also holding up either a shield or an animal skin, and the bull of heaven is right on top of him, so he's going to have trouble getting rid of it if it's a skin. Perseus makes a lot more sense. His legs are open, he has a sword, and it's ready. And boom! We come to our central myth of this Roman cult, the slaying of the bull, the so-called tauroctony. You find a Mithraian, you find a tauroctony, although not ever of this high quality. This particular example, of course, is in the Vatican. The cap that Mithras is wearing is the renowned Phrygian cap. They were wearing that cap again in the French Revolution. It was a symbol of liberty for them. Hey, you remember our gay rapture with Zeus and Ganymede in the Gospel of Luke? Guess where Ganymede's from? Phrygia.
Now, it's when I was looking over this image that I realized, oh my God, Mark got the idea of organizing his gospel around the signs of the Zodiac from Roman soldiers. Now, this is, from what we can gather, exclusively male cult, although there's might be some examples of that, counterexamples of that, and largely military. And we know there were members of the cult of Mithras in the army that destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. So the reason why Christianity and Mithraism look so much alike is that at the very beginning, well, of course, we both have suppers, specific details, but it's especially striking because in the beginning,
We adopted their system, but it's important to remember we redrafted it from the ground up in the image of Jesus Christ. And they were probably helping us. In fact, in light of my connection that I've just forged in this video, in fact, as while I was creating this video, between the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, I have no doubt that soldiers were talking to Jesus Christ himself about this. So if you're a scholar and your specialty is the cult of Mithras, you might want to start reading the Gospel of Mark. Now, in my last video, I showed that the saints Flavia Domitilla and Nereus and Archelaus all betray a knowledge of secret Mark, where they're also forging a connection between Christianity and Mithraism. Now, the Mithraeum, where the Mithraists met for their initiations, are all in caves. And what are the first large Christian structures that we know of? The catacombs, like the catacombs of Flavia Domitilla. These are artificial caves. And they were building all of this at the exact same time. Okay? Now, why would we adopt this psychological technology? Because it works. That's why I did this series. In fact, as I said in the beginning, I've now shown that I've chosen the name of this series very, very well, A Boot Camp for Saints. This is a soldier's religion. I really think this is the Holy Spirit at work here, but it's not my place to say that. Someone outside of yourself has to say you're speaking for the Holy Spirit. Now, why is it important? Let's look at the context and compare it to our own. Compare the reaction of our government to this very similar context. The Roman Empire is growing, just like we have a bunch of aliens rushing into our country. And communities across the Mediterranean are starting to dissolve into that culture. Now, our psyches, our conscious orientation, we're all connected to the local manifestation of the collective unconscious. And as that local manifestation starts to dissolve, our consciousness dissolves with it. Now, what you're seeing today with a part of our elites, this is exactly what they want. But for the Romans, this was a bad thing. I would guess the Roman government answered this challenge by getting together their greatest proto-psychologists, just beginning of psychologists and their priests. The result is the cult of Mithras. Now, there's evidence that there's a single point man who was involved in all of this. Maybe a Greek who come from the East and knew about all this. So it still could have come from probably something like Turkey. Now, it's important to distinguish the difference between a mystery religion, which is what Mithras is, and a religion per se. Or as I've said in several of my videos, do not confuse your psychology for your theology. Now, the psychology is about coming to grips with the depths of your psyche, okay, and acquiring a proper center of gravity, a place of rest. When you get unmoored, when you lose that place, you start getting uneasy. A lot of people do. And when those people are part of the army, that's going to be part of a problem. Now, for our modern leaders, that's not the bug, that's a feature. It's what they want. They want you away from any kind of center of gravity because they want to be able to control you. So tell me who's the cruel barbarians. People talk about the Romans being cruel. I think they tried very hard not to be cruel. This is proof of that. My ancestors. Now, a religion per se tells you how to revere the gods. And confusing those two is a big problem. As Carl Jung pointed out, the later Gnostic Christians were psychologists who thought they were theologians. Now, when we look very briefly at Iranian Mithraism, briefly because Iranian Mithraism doesn't have a lot to do with the Gospel of Mark, we're going to be looking more at a religion per se, although it has a very rich and deep psychological component. Otherwise, it wouldn't work as a religion. Now, don't get upset because we're looking at this paganism here and all this. No. Everything got mixed together back in the day with religion. Even something that you think is cut and dry, like physics and mathematics, even those had a heavy religious component. Just ask the Pythagoreans. Okay? Now let's get back to our tauroctony.
I told you earlier that I would be able to visually connect Scorpio with both death and sex, and here we are. The scorpion has latched onto the bull's genitals. And what is he doing right at the instant of his death? He's having an orgasm. You see his semen splashing on the rock. And no, that's not what the head of a well-formed bull penis looks like. And yes, I looked. I considered it part of my job. The snake is right next to the penis at 90 degrees or thereabouts and is an obvious phallic symbol itself, always has been. And just as the semen erupts from the head of the penis, blood erupts into the mouth of the snake. Here's another example of a tauroctony. Once again, the bull is having an orgasm, thus confirming that this detail is not peculiar to the Vatican example. This is not just a tauroctony, the slaughter of a bull. This is a rapture. like you would have on your wedding night. Up to this very instant, Mithras has ridden this bull like you would ride your lover. He pierces him just at the moment of exhaustion, or rather, blissful release. And what does a man typically do after that? He goes to sleep, or in the bull's case, the final sleep, death. So, every single element from Secret Mark is right in front of you. It's erotic, man on man, even if one of the male figures is an animal. Scorpio. The only thing missing is a resurrection, and since Mithras is associated with the sun, you'd expect that here. But I don't think that's quite what we're going to get with this cult.
Obviously, there are differences. Christ is the sacrifice instead of the bull, and he's also the rider. I have a feeling something like that was going on with the Mithraists as well, because basically we're split in two. We have roots in heaven as well as here on earth. Now this goes back at least, probably beyond, but at least to the allegory of the chariot from Plato. Now we're driving a two-horse chariot. One of the horses is noble and behaves nobly. The other is not. So we're having trouble driving our chariot. And I think the cult of Mithras aimed to remedy that. So we have the two horses here would be Sol, the sun, and the bull. Now Mithras himself is something completely different. I'm going to get into that. Just remember, we're split in two, because that's going to come up later. Now Jesus' action in Mark is more potent, because Jesus is God. Therefore, he's acting at a cosmic level. And, here's most important, he's redeeming our physical bodies. We are sons of Adam, Ha-Adam. And we come from the earth, Ha-Adamah. So we are the earthlings, or the groundlings. Now, what is the nature of original sin? Well, when we disobeyed God, we cursed the ground. Either our action cursed it, or God cursed it. I don't read Hebrew, I don't understand exactly what's going on. But the ground is cursed. Well, that's what we pull our physical bodies from. And that needs to be redeemed. And also, I'd like to point out, as I have in several videos, Christianity is not a Platonic religion like you see with the Gnostics. You know, the spirit up there runs everything. And no, we're Aristotelian. The body is very much part of the soul, and therefore, again, must be redeemed.
Here's another important Mithraic image, the lion man. Remember that as well, the lion who's become a man. There's a mystery as to who he is. Is he a god? He's called Arimaneus at least once. Obviously the Zoroastrian Ahriman of Persia, connecting us back to Mithras over there, the personification of evil in the world. But does he look evil to you? Yes, he's strange, but don't confuse strange with evil. The cherubim associated with Ezekiel's renowned wheels look almost exactly like this. Most scholars, however, agree that he is associated with time and seasonal change, and they typically call him Ion. And by wild coincidence, personified images of the seasons show up in the catacombs of Flavia Domitia, some of the very few non-Christian symbols that do. Psychologically speaking, this is the very image of a healthy, individuated human being. The lion is a sun symbol, and the sun is a symbol of consciousness par excellence. But we are just not brains floating above the world. We are embedded in bodies, and every part of our body has its own native intelligence and wisdom. I talk about that in my video, How the Brain and the Body Work Together, link below. The intelligence or wisdom is represented by the serpent, which typically is wrapped around the body of the lion man, and quite often its head rests upon his head. The wrapping in imagery is important. It is the circumambulation, the walking around the center, or the enantiodromia, the movement back and forth. Really, circumambulation seen from the side. This is required in this world to become a full personality. Without that movement, you wither on the vine. I've been talking about that movement, precisely that movement throughout this series. Of course, the Zodiac itself is a wheel. Don't be disturbed by the serpent either. The serpent is not evil, it's ambiguous, both psychologically and in the Bible. Its wisdom is wild and it can go either way. So yes, this probably is a god, but as a fit and proper psychological portrait of the kind of man this mystery cult was trying to form, it also represents the ultimate goal of every initiate. Mithras emerging from the stone. Notice it looks like an egg. Notice the signs of the Zodiac circling around it, okay? To the right is an unfinished work by Michelangelo. If I were a Mithraist and nobody was looking, I would steal it and shuttle it off to my local Mithraian. C.G. Jung had an American studying under him, and like all would-be therapists, even today, she herself had to go through therapy. In Part 1, Volume 9 of his collected works, he shows a series of drawings she did for him while she was undergoing that process. Here, she's just started her journey. from the essay, Studying the Process of Individuation. As usually happens with beginners and people with no skill at hand, the drawing of the picture caused her considerable difficulties. In such cases, it is very easy for the unconscious to slip its subliminal images into the painting. Thus it came about that the big boulders would not appear on the paper in their real form, but took on unexpected shapes. They look, some of them, like hard-boiled eggs, cut in two, with the yolk in the middle. Others were like pointed pyramids. It was in one of these that Miss X was stuck, her hair blown out behind her, and the movement of the sea suggested a strong wind. The picture shows, first of all, her imprisoned state, but not yet the act of liberation. So it was there that she was attached to the earth, in the land of her mother. Psychologically, this state means being stuck in the unconscious. Her inadequate relationship with her mother had left behind something dark and in need of development. Since she succumbed to the magic of her motherland and tried to express this by painting, it is obvious that she is still stuck with half her body in Mother Earth. That is, she is still partly identical with the mother, and what is more, through that part of the body that contains just the secret of the mother that she had never inquired into. Yet another recurring image in the Mithraic cult is Sol. To the left, riding his quadriga. To the right, Sol is approaching Mithras. I could not find any images of Sol kneeling, which is exactly what the young man does in Mark's Gospel, and only in that Gospel. Talk about that in Libra. But I know that was commonly shown in Mithraic iconography. And of course, Jesus pointed out that the rich young man was indeed calling him a god, which is exactly what Mithras is, who you see in his Phrygian cap. Now please note the signs of the zodiac surrounding Sol's quadriga. And oh my, a Virgo and a Virgo, which is exactly what I talked about in the Libra section. Libra is relatively new. The space was always there, but before Libra showed up, it was shared either with Virgo or Scorpio. This mosaic shares the space with Virgo. That's exactly what we see in the Gospel of Mark. And check it out. It's our birth image again. You see Cancer drawn in right next to Leo. You see the lion very clearly, followed by Virgo. Then you see a space, and then Scorpio, who's upside down. And notice what they drew in between the two. A second Virgo. Our final image is of a feast. And sometimes Mithras and Sol are seated just like this. I suspect it's a wedding feast, meant to unite our higher and lower selves together. But isn't this exactly how the beloved disciple leans back against Jesus during the Last Supper? Two naked men, spooning each other over a celebratory feast. If this isn't homoerotic, I have no idea what is.
Now, don't go making the mistake of assuming that Jesus is a fictional character just because he lived an archetypical life. He's God. You might expect that. We know that he's real because his followers went through a lot of trouble to preserve his sayings. The internal evidence for that in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke is quite clear. They seem to be working from something called a Q source, a collection of Jesus' saying, Quella, German for source. Also, when you compare the different Gospel writers treating the same quote from Jesus to the same quote treated by different pagan writers, okay, you see that the Christian writers take a lot more care. Their sayings are much more alike. So they're more careful to treat as sayings, which is what you would do to somebody who's real. Now, there is another collection of Jesus' sayings that we'd heard of. We known about it for centuries from the church fathers, the Gospel of Thomas. And we found fragments of it about 130 years ago, I think. We didn't know what they were. But then we found a full collection in Nag Hammadi, a village of Egypt, in 1945. Now, there's very good evidence that the Gospel of Thomas was written a long time after the Gospels we have, up to 200 years. But the argument over whether or not it is early is alive and well, like everything in Mithraism. I've always been in the early camp, and my position on that is deepened here. For one thing, Thomas is a collection of sayings just like Q, so it's what we're looking for. It's what we were looking for at the time. Also, a lot of these sayings are weird. Something is on Jesus's radar that we're not factoring in. I think that it's Mithraism. Now, with my new discoveries here firmly in hand, I can turn the tables on what I consider to be a very serious objection against an early dating for Thomas, an objection that needs to be answered. And that's the objection that it seems Gnostic, or at least proto-Gnostic. And scholars argue even over that, confirming that we're missing something here. Now, I now believe that some of the sayings that make it seem Gnostic are actually Mithraic. Because again, some of the sayings are weird. We're going to look at them. And since Mithraism had such a big impact on Mark, and almost certainly the Q source, because Luke quotes a Q source, and it seems to have heavy Mithraic coloring. And Mark, by the way, was the first gospel written. Then a Mithraic coloring of Thomas would support an early dating for Thomas, especially once again since we're not looking for it. Now, one of the criticisms of an early dating of Thomas includes an analysis that I think fairly demonstrates that it comes from the church in Syria. Well, that's exactly where we find most of the artifacts outside of the Western Roman Empire. So that's another score for my case. Even better, the Mithraists weren't the biggest problem for the church in the 2nd or maybe even the 3rd century, when Thomas was supposed to have been written, if it's late. As I said, up to 200 years after our current Gospels. The Gnostics were the big problem. That's why scholars were looking for Gnostics. But what school of Gnosticism? It doesn't fit any of them. Therefore, it actually doesn't fit the later dating on those grounds, on the grounds of Gnosticism. It fits an early dating. That is assuming that Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas is reacting to Mithraism, that Thomas is clarifying Jesus' position on Mithraism. Let me show you why I think that's happening.
Jesus said, "Blessings on the lion that the human will eat, that the lion becomes human. And cursed is the human that the lion will eat, and the lion will become human." Boom, Aeon, Arimaneus, the lion-headed man, or God. I told you to keep an eye out for him. So the thrust of this saying indicates to me that you better eat or there's a good chance you will get eaten. Now this passage struck some readers as Gnostic because Yaldabaoth, the evil god who created the world, had a lion face. But this literary lion is just as ambivalent as our Mithraic stone lions. Good match so far, yes? Jesus said, "This heaven will pass away, and the one above it will pass away. The dead are not alive, and the living will not die. During the days you ate what is dead, you made it alive. When you were in the light, what will you do? On the day when you were one, you became two. But when you become two, what will you do?" So here, by my reckoning, Jesus is once again talking about Aeon, who's the lion in saying 7. He looms above the heavens just as Perseus or Mithras looms above the constellations. But there was also the relatively recent discovery of the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth is wobbling at the poles, and the timing of the sun's trek through the Zodiac cycles itself through a 26,000-year span. Right now, for example, the sun actually enters Aries in April, but 13,000 years from now, it'll enter Aries in October. So we've been looking at a smaller cycle all these centuries, embedded in a much longer cycle. That might be what Jesus is talking about here. It might have been one of the inspirations for the creation of the cult of Mithras in the first place. Who are the dead? Those who are not alive. Those who have not heard the teachings of the living Jesus. Then I assume he's talking about how we're going to live when we're actually in the light. Finally, he talks about our split personalities, which are in desperate need of reconciliation. There's that split I told you to look for.
This passage tells me that Jesus did not have a problem with Mithraism. In fact, I think he had a lot of respect for the system, as long as Mithraists knew their place in the cosmic hierarchy, which became a problem later under the Roman Emperor Julian, the apostate. As a psychological system meant to unify the personality of Roman soldiers so that they die well and respect hierarchy, it's perfectly fine. But in matters of heaven and earth and the ultimate fate of mankind, they must step aside. That is the prerogative of Jesus alone.
Jesus said, "Whoever's come to know the world has discovered a carcass, and whoever has discovered a carcass, of that person the world is not worthy." This is one of the sayings that look very Gnostic. The pure soul is trapped in meat. But we now see that what Jesus is actually doing is reinforcing the lesson for the Mithraists. Right now the world seems very alive and active, but it's a dead man walking. Here in America, that's what we call a man who's walking to his own execution. He saw a Samaritan carrying a lamb as he was going to Judea. He said to his disciples, "That person is carrying the lamb around." They said to him, "Then he may kill it and eat it." He said to them, "He will not eat it while it is alive, but only after he has killed it and it has become a carcass." They said, "Otherwise he cannot do it." He said to them, "So also with you. Seek for yourselves a place for rest, or you might become a carcass and be eaten." Warning to the disciples, get your proper center of gravity, and remember, if you are not alive, then you are dead. Now, this all confirms what I said in my last video on this series, which in turn confirms an early dating for Thomas. Ride the wheel while you're on it, and ride it well. But keep in mind the day will come where you will no longer have to ride that wheel, and we will have a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem.
Now, Mithraism is a soldier's religion, and if we're going to have the kind of heavy interaction with Mark that I suspect, then surely it will become obvious in the other Gospels once we know to look for it. And indeed it does. In fact, it shows up in a passage that I've been using for 2 years now to prove that Jesus is pro-gay, proving, now more than ever, that Jesus is pro-gay.
The centurion and his servant, or slave, or maybe more than that, the details here will matter. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave, whom he valued highly, and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us." And Jesus went with them. But when he was not far away from the house, the centurion sent his friends to say to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I do not presume to come to you, but only speak the word, and let my servant be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes. To my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." This is exactly what a Mithraists would say. Thus we have a Mithras acknowledging that Jesus is the master. This falls right in line with what I was reading in the Gospel of Thomas. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." In fact, this pagan Mithras is more than equal to any Israelite. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Now let's look at the language. The New Revised Standard Version is a fantastic translation for serious Bible users, and their editorial decisions really shine here. First, we have a slave. All different grammatical variations of the Greek dia, slave. But this slave is intimos, dear. He's a highly esteemed person. One who is described in such a manner sits at a high place of honor at a feast, which is why Jesus warns you to sit at a low place when you first arrive, so that you avoid being demoted later, and therefore humiliated. And the word is used for Jesus himself in 1 Peter 2, 4, and 6. Jesus, who is a slave to all. Jesus told that to the sons of thunder in our Scorpio section. But here's what this young man really is: a pais, a boy, translated as servant instead of slave, and properly so. But whether he spoke Greek or Latin, a man also called his lover his boy. And that's who this man was, the centurion's lover. And Luke couches this passage in a context that confirms that. Going to our famous gay rapture with our Phrygian hero, Luke points right back to this story. Verses 7 through 10. A slave does what a slave is expected to do. He uses the Greek dio. 11 through 19, 10 lepers are healed. The only one who shows any gratitude to Jesus is the despised alien Samaritan. Once again, an outsider is making the natives look bad. The gay rapture represents Jesus as a thunder god, which is exactly, again, what the Transfiguration does, as opposed to Matthew's Helios and Apollo, and Mark's new Gilgamesh. And because the Gospels are very big on having gay lovers who are age and temperament appropriate, in Luke's version of Peter's 3 denials of Jesus, Peter called the servant girl a woman, and nobody else does that, including John. And this passage in particular is amazing because John rarely ever parallels the other Gospels. So, just as that girl is a woman, this boy is a man. Matthew reorganizes this story, and he also makes interesting changes to the language in my favor. The boy is never a dios. He is always a pais. Thus, the New Revised Standard Version always calls him a servant. Why? Well, let's find out. When he entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, appealing to him and saying, "Lord, my pais is lying at home paralyzed in terrible distress." And he said to him, I will come and cure him." The centurion answered, "Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word, and my pais will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my doulo, 'Do this,' and the doulo does it." I put it in brackets because it's not actually in the Greek, but it's fine. They put it there. When Jesus heard him, he was amazed, and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, Many will come from east and west and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. There's your feast again. While the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion, Jesus said, Go, let it be done for you according to your faith. And the pais was healed in that hour. This is the genius of the Gospels that the New Testament critics do not appreciate. And this is an outstanding example of the genius and, dare I say, humanity of Greco-Roman biography in general.
If you want a full picture of what happened, then you read Luke. But if you want to look at the intimate connection between Jesus and the centurion, then you read Matthew. They are front and center. Anything that gets in the way is moved aside, which is perfectly acceptable under the rules of Greco-Roman rhetoric. As is typical for Matthew, the word count drops. He usually contracts his story. And with Matthew, we know for a stone-cold certainty that this centurion called that young man his boy. Now, this kind of interaction that we see among the four Gospels, you can even call it a dance. There is no equal in the Greco-Roman world. This is a literary and intellectual triumph of Christianity, these four Gospels, and you don't have to be a Christian to acknowledge that. But Luke goes one better, because up to now, I just stopped with the story of the centurion. I never looked past it. But when I was researching this video, I realized Luke has a version of Secret Mark. Maybe it's another young man that he resurrected from the dead, and he colored this story with the story of Secret Mark, or maybe this is just Secret Mark in disguise. Either way, right next to our Mithraic soldier, there's no way that's an accident.
The resurrection of the widow's only son at Nain. Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain. So he's coming into a place just like he was coming into Bethany. And his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of a town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. So we have a woman with a young man, except this time it's his mother instead of sister. This is why I lean to this being a disguised secret mark. They're alluding to Ereshkigal mourning for her son Ninazu. That would be the case if it were a disguised secret mark. In that case, again, it would be an example of a narrative that must be included even outside of its proper context. It sheds critical light on the character of the main subject. In this case, of course, the main subject is Jesus. That's the number one goal of a Greco-Roman biographer. And with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still, just as Jesus reaches out and touches the young man by the hand to raise him. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." Neoniske, the vocative masculine singular, the exact word we see in Secret Mark. The dead man sat up and began to speak, just as the young man begs to stay with him in Secret Mark. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. The kingdom of God is at hand, just like in Secret Mark.
Now I'm going to finish by taking a quick look at Iranian Mithraism. It's not going to be nearly as intense as it was with the Roman because it didn't have the influence on the mark that the Roman did. There are parallels between the two. Mithras slaughters the cosmic bull, famously. They celebrate that to this day in Iran in the fall. Some consider it the new year because some like fall better than spring. I'm one of those people. But Mark starts in the spring in Aries, and that's when the bull is slaughtered. Also, I doubt their bull is having an orgasm. Another difference, the Tauroctony is central to the Roman Mithras mystery. While it is obviously important with the Iranian school, it's a lot more marginal. Finally, the Roman iconography makes it clear that this is tightly linked with the constellations and the signs of the Zodiac. So we may assume their mysteries are likewise tightly linked to it. This is our connection with Mark. On the other hand, I view Iranian Mithraism as more of a religion per se, although it does have a very rich, deep psychological component which C.G. Jung respected.
According to Mithraists, there is no radical opposition between good and evil. In chapter 5, it is argued that Mithra, who is seen as the champion and savior of humanity, is a just and impartial mediator in the cosmic battle between the forces of Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. Moreover, Ahriman and Ormazd are twins, born of a single mother, who is also their father, an androgynous deity called Zorvan, and sometimes later simply referred to as Zaman, or time. So there's your Aeon. Finally, Ahriman is the firstborn of the two, and essentially dominates this world, because Zorvan was seduced by Oz into unconsciously giving birth to evil before good. Oz is a female personification of primordial chaos, and a concupiscence, which is the root of all other desirous passions. The supreme god only becomes good over the course of time. She only gives birth to Ormazd after obtaining self-consciousness by witnessing the exteriorization of his or her own inner evil. This process of God transcending unconscious concupiscence, hypostasized by the feminine archdemon Oz, is symbolized by Ormazd triumphing over Ahriman at the conclusion of a battle extending through ages of human history. Psychologically speaking, a lot of what we regard as evil is in reality just something good that got turned around in our heads.
So if you were to bring me a dream that you thought was a bad dream, I would tell you there's no such thing as a bad dream. For example, my Jungian therapist wrote about one of her patients who had a common dream, a consistent dream, a recurring dream of his son who was being tortured, which is obviously terrible. But once they were able to circumambulate around that dream a few sessions, he was able to bring that unconscious content that had been plaguing him into consciousness, and the dream disappeared. I had epic zombie dreams for years, but when I got out of therapy, those dreams disappeared. Now, once again, the mistake that the Iranians make and Dr. Giorgiani makes and the Kabbalists make is they're confusing their psychology for their theology. This has nothing to do with God. Evil is not a byproduct of anything. It is its own dog. It has its own agenda. It knows exactly what it's doing. Now, a good antidote to this kind of thinking is Aristotle's unmoved mover, or uncaused cause, followed by a strong course of St. Thomas Aquinas. If you want a good introduction to it, you can go to Dr. Edward Fesser's The Last Superstition. This is about the proofs of God's existence. God is not an assumption, it is a conclusion. He is a conclusion. Now you can see from the above description that the Romans were almost certainly, obviously, influenced by Iranian Mithraism, but there's a difference. For them, Mithra, arbitrates between Ahriman and Ormazd. But for this system, Mithra kills Ahriman, slays him, and he and Sol, who is Ormazd, feast on his flesh and therefore integrate him into consciousness. This is very much like we integrate Christ with the Mass, but at a cosmic level. Then Sol marries Mithra, and the two become one flesh. Now notice, they look like twins. We homosexuals are associated with divine twinship, but also with the death and the resurrection that must precede it, must come before it. The Amorites made Gilgamesh and Enkidu into lovers, which they were not in the original Sumerian stories. They also made them into twins, which obviously they were not either. Gilgamesh is taller, but Enkidu is broader of shoulders. These are archetypes anchored very deep in the collective unconscious. Now, something else to keep in mind, our goal is not to become Christians, our goal is to become Christs. We are to become gods and sit among the sons of God in council. Thus, Sol is an intimate union with Mithras. But before we have this union, the flesh must be nailed to the cross, the sinful flesh must be nailed to the cross alongside the Lord and die. One other thing of note, the Romans seem to have brought in the philosophy of Plato and mixed it in with Iranian Mithraism, and then built their school of psychology on top of that foundation. So in the Platonic terminology, the lower horse is folded into the upper horse, which is folded into the charioteer. Now, the Romans weren't ones to just sit back and let things happen, and neither is the Roman Catholic Church, neither do the Protestants. We Protestants that follow out of it. For example, we have the church triumphant in heaven, the church suffering in purgatory, because you still must pay. When you sin, there's consequences. We're not going to go into that. But on earth, what do we have? The church militant, fighting to bring heaven on earth. We don't sit back and just let this happen. This can go on forever. In fact, outside of the bounds of Christianity, this dialectical process has soured in the last 14 centuries. It got very, very nasty 100 years ago. It's getting very, very nasty again. This is far more consistent with the demonic counteroffensive in reaction to Christ's triumph on the cross than it is any kind of dialectical unfolding. Well, now let's go to CG, as his friends like to call him.
From his paper Gnostic Symbols of the Self in Aeon, Volume 9, Part 2 of his collected works. The last book we looked at was Part 1. The same knowledge, formulated differently to suit the age they lived in, was possessed by the Gnostics. The idea of an unconscious was not unknown to them. For instance, Epiphanius quotes an excerpt from one of the Valentinian letters, which says, "In the beginning, the autopator, the unfathered father, contained within himself everything that is, in a state of unconsciousness, literally not knowing, agnosia." So the Father is not only unconscious and without the quality of being, but also near dvandva, without opposites, lacking all qualities and therefore unknowable. This describes the state of the unconscious. The Valentinian text gives the autopator more positive qualities. Some called him the ageless Eon, eternally young, male and female, who contains everything in himself and is himself contained by nothing. In him was ennoia, consciousness, which conveys the treasures of the greatness to those who come from the greatness. But the presence of the ennoia does not prove that the autopator himself is conscious, for the differentiation of consciousness results only from the syzygies and tetrads that follow afterwards, all of them symbolizing processes of conjugation and composition. Ennoia must be thought of here as the latent possibility of consciousness. Euler translates it as mens, Cornarius as intelligentia, and notio. And as you can tell from the title alone of this volume, Jung has the Mithraic divinities Ormazd and Ahriman very firmly in mind. And here you see our old friend Ion himself. Good catch, Dr. Jung. And may I add, this is one of the things that splits Mithraism of Rome from Persia. They see this character as a man. And Dr. Giorgiani himself has some very interesting things to say about this. On this view, from a psychological perspective, just as order cannot be fundamentally separated from chaos, the chaotic unconscious always underlines any rational consciousness that appears to be at work in the living world or the universe at large, including and especially in the human mind. That Oz is the catalyst for the creation of the cosmos, and at the same time the archdemon, whose essential concupiscence is the root of the demons of need, avarice, lust, wrath, and vengeance, means that these passions are not deranging influences from outside of the God-given rational soul of the human being. Rather, the mind of God itself is afflicted by the essence of these passions at the deepest level. God is fundamentally unconscious, and therefore also needy, lustful, jealous, wrathful, and vengeful. Creation is driven by God's need to fill a profound sense of want, which, given the feminine aspect of Zorophan as an androgynous god, is akin to the sexual desire to be filled. Only by facing the exterioration of these aspects of its own being does the creator or creatrix become progressively more conscious and bounteous in the benevolent sense over vast epochs of time. That means that, from a moral standpoint, the initial impetus for creation is evil.
Now, I don't mean to pick a fight, but there's a couple of major mistakes he's made in his book so far, and I'll grant you I have not finished this book. First, here, he incorrectly states that the unconscious is chaotic. It is not. It may seem chaotic, just like it can seem sinister and evil. But the examples I've given from therapy indicate that that's not true, that it's actually very well ordered. The unconscious is the unconscious. It has a life of its own. It lives in a space that treats time differently. There might not even be time where it exists, because it often predicts the future. It has its own geography, as I'll show you in a moment, and speaking personally, it has its own volition. It has its own life. My unconscious has raised red flags. It has amused me when I was miserable. There were a couple of times I was laughing so loud and hard in my dreams that it woke me up. And believe me, I needed it. My unconscious responded to therapy. I got plenty of stories about that. The woman that we just talked about, I believe, is at Rockefeller. And her dreams and her art unfolds in a manner that's almost scientifically predictable. In fact, later in his life, Carl Jung got so good at dealing with the unconscious, he didn't have to work with dreams or anything very much. That's how ordered it is, how rational it is. Carl Jung also walked through the dreams of the renowned physicist Wolfgang Pauli. He walks through those. Same thing happened. Secondly, I think it's a good time to address some serious miscalculations critics of the God of the Old Testament have made. And those miscalculations become outright deranged when you bring in the New Testament. Dr. Giorgiani and a lot of people base their critiques on the Christian God on those deranged miscalculations. Dr. Giorgiani thinks the wrathful God of Israel is a prime example that we live in the world in the thrall of a God who is wrathful because he's unconscious.
Now, the God of Israel is indeed wrathful, and quite often he seems to get worked up over petty details. But you're not a God. How do you know what's petty? Don't eat the fruit of the tree of not good and evil. Well, that's a minor thing. Is it? How do you know? You don't know that. But if you actually pay attention to the text, I mean, just take the text at its own word. Okay, don't read into it. Maybe it's wrong. It's okay. Take it at its word. Follow the text. It's easily demonstrable that he is mightily provoked. His wrath is not proof of his unconsciousness or his ignorance. It's proof of his mercy. We all deserve to get thrown into hell. And let me check it out. Let me give you an example. He created an entire race miraculously out of Abraham and Sarah. And then later, a member of that race, Joseph, by the grace of the God of Abraham and Sarah, okay, interprets a dream of Pharaoh that nobody else could interpret, that his gods could not interpret. And using that dream, Pharaoh is able to take advantage of a catastrophic famine to unify Egypt. Famine, unify. Now, we now know the context for this. The first kingdom, the old kingdom of Egypt, was destroyed by a famine. It was so vast it affected North America. North Africa was wetland, and it was pasture, and in a single generation that all went away. Government fractured. The governors got power at the expense of the central government, at the expense of the pharaoh. And you could tell that from looking at their tombs, which became extravagant. So famine destroys Egypt. Thanks to the God of Abraham and Sarah and the God of Jacob, famine unites Egypt. Can you see why he's second in power only to Pharaoh? And then, of course, there's the big display in power, which is the Exodus. And yet, despite all that, they betray God. So imagine what the rest of the world is like. As I talked about before, this souring of the dialectical movement of the world? No. It's rotten. There's no getting around it. So then we move to the New Testament. God has demonstrated that we are trapped in our sin. He responds by incarnating in the flesh and proves that there is no demand he makes on us that he doesn't personally make on himself. He goes one better. He fulfills our obligations for us. How's that for missing the mark on your critique? You have to deal with that. Deal with the story. Might not be true, but... Now back to Iranian Mithraism. There's one more interesting aspect of it that brings it very nicely in accord with the Gospel of Mark, but only marginally, if at all, with Roman Mithraism, as far as I can tell. Now back in my videos on Libra and Virgo, I demonstrate that Mark goes out of his way to show that Jesus the Christ, who is a man, is also woman wisdom from the Old Testament, that they're the same person. Now this has echoes in Iranian Mithraism as well as the Gospel of Thomas. And by the way, Thomas is not his name. His name is Judas. He's called Thomas Didymus. Thomas is Aramaic for twin. Didymus is Greek for twin. Twin. Divine twinship. More people need to listen to the words that come out of my mouth.
Anahita is the female counterpart of Mithra, and she is invoked together with the war god on the Achaemenid inscriptions. Like Mithra, she drives a chariot with 4 horses in a battle against the Devas. There's your quadriga. This also suggests that she is an Ashura or Ahura, a titan or titaness. The 4 horses of her chariot are rain, snow, hail, and wind. The degree to which Mithra and Anahita are conflated, and Mithra himself was seen as feminine or at least hermaphroditic deity, encompassing the qualities of Anahita, is reflected in Herodotus' claim that the Persians worshipped the celestial Aphrodite under the name Mithra. What is recorded here by Herodotus is a primordial phase of Iranian religion, wherein Anahita was not a separate being from Mithra, and where Mithra was believed to be hermaphroditic. It seems that at some point, as Mithra was masculinized, what had been his feminine aspect had split off and was worshipped in the form of a goddess figure, who was understood to be both his mother and his consort. In other words, the divine feminine matrix, in which the god gives birth to himself. Simon Peter said to them, "Mary should leave us, for females are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "Look, I shall guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter heaven's kingdom."
So now I will sum up what I think is the progress of the initiate through the Mithraic mysteries, which are not much of a mystery if you know the geography of the human psyche. Now, if it sounds incredible to you that such a thing should exist, think about it. We're all based on a common human body plan. So it's not unreasonable to think that we might also exist on a common human psyche plan.
This map is not new to me. You can find it on the internet right now if you look. That's where I got it. I just prettied it up. I don't want this to become a Jungian lesson video, so let's just keep this brief.
Three critical characters, shall we say, from this psychic plan plainly show up in the iconography: the self, the ego, and the soul image. You might have heard of the anima and the animus. The incarnation of a man's unconscious is female, anima. The incarnation of a woman's unconscious is male, the animus. If you're a man and you see a woman in your dream, it's probably your anima. If you're a woman, you're animus. The ego, of course, is the light of our conscious orientation. That little wrapping around it is the persona. That means mask. It's the character mask we present to the public. The self is the sum total of the personality, which, as you can see, is mostly unconscious. In fact, the vast majority is unconscious. The diagram would be unreadable if I drew it to proper scale. Now the self, the ego, and the anima, because we're talking exclusively about men here, show up in the iconography as Mithras, Sol, the sun, and Luna. It is only through the intervention of the higher self, the divine twin of the conscious ego, that the rampaging bull can be slain. Sol is on the upper left. Luna is on the upper right. Both look on the scene as if it's a completely different person performing the action. That's what I mean when I tell you the unconscious has a life of its own. In fact, it has several. That's why you can be surprised by dreams and stuff. It's not you who's making those dreams. Two men flank the action. One holds a torch pointing down to the unconscious. One holds a torch pointing up into the light of the unconscious. These two men show up all over the place. They are, in fact, the walls of the cooking pot in which all this action must happen. And it is quite energetic and even dangerous psychologically. That's why it's important to have friends to help you and lots of privacy. That's also why these mystery cults are mysterious. They're designed from the ground up to shepherd you through to the end. They don't want you carrying your baggage into the process, and every step of the way must catch you by surprise. As these men also wear Phrygian caps, they can be seen as mini Mithras, which would mean Mithras is both the heat and the vessel which contains the heat, which would make sense since he is by definition the fullness of the whole personality, which means he's part of everything the person does and therefore is. But in this case, only the self can be the vessel, because it is only the self that can fly at this extreme height and drop to that extreme depth. In Christianity and at the cosmic level, Mithras' counterpart is obviously Jesus, who is the sacrifice and the temple and the priest. See how that makes sense? We Christians aren't so crazy after all. In alchemy, which C.G. Jung treated as another form of psychotherapy, another form of Gnosticism in fact, this cooking pot is called the was, the vessel, the equipment, the apparatus the alchemists use to heat his elements. And indeed, the whole arc of this tableau that this tableau is bound in is itself a was. It's also known as a temenos from the Greek. It is a space typically segregated off by walls for chieftains, kings, and gods. The necessity for surprise and mystery is apparent in Jung's quote from earlier. The fact that this woman didn't know how to draw actually helped. And this is why the mystery cults were so successful at keeping their mysteries a secret. If you benefited from them and then went out and blabbed, then frankly, you were just an asshole. And everybody would have thought that. Many of them would have told you that. So now let's step through the process. The self emerges out of the unconscious. Mithras emerges out of the earth. Matter, the stuff that everything in the universe is made of, comes from the Latin mater, mother. So Dr. Giorgiani's statements that Anahita is the female counterpart of Mithra, and she is a goddess figure who is understood to be both his mother and his consort, makes perfect sense psychologically. Remember, the self includes the unconscious. But none of this applies to the upper realm. This is not about what God needs. Know your place. The Mithras drops down to the bull, rides it until it is exhausted, then slays it. See, it reads like a comic. Drops, slays. Then we have our wedding feast. The bull is consumed. His flesh and his spirit is integrated into the conscious ego. The conscious ego is wedded and folded into the self. Thus our personality is integrated. We are no longer split in two. Chaos is gone. Order rules.
So, psychologically speaking, a heterosexual couple represents the union between the conscious ego and the anima or the animus. But a gay male couple represents the union between the conscious ego and the higher self. Not so perverted and deviant after all. So it makes me very sad and alarmed to see so many men running away from their physical maleness and pretending like they're women.
and it's mostly men are doing this. Women are rarely ever doing this. It's not just the thing between your legs. It's just the thing between the legs. It's just plumbing. No, it's not. Every cell in your body, all the tissue in your body, it's all male. They, of course, are being egged on by a transsexual social movement, which is in turn an astroturf campaign from the demonic enemies of Jesus Christ. Grassroots campaign is from the ground up, driven by the people. What is astroturf? Fake grass. Their ultimate goal is the annihilation of all dialectical opposition, which, as we have seen, makes thinking possible. And they have not stopped with the male and the female. They've moved into the inner and the outer. They're heavy into thought crimes. These are the same people who were in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. Thought crimes. They're annihilating the distinction between the above and below. They, of course, being above. Naturally, of course. And don't think you're going to meddle with them. They're going to meddle with you all the time, though. Now, as I said in the beginning, we are obliged to ask, why would God, who's incarnated in the flesh, marry another man? And to answer that question, we need to compare this resurrection story from Scorpio with the one we're more familiar with in the Gospel of John. And we need to bring in the cult of Mithras. Long story short, Jesus' resurrection of and marriage to Lazarus is a point of no return in both Gospels. In John, Jesus made sure Lazarus was dead and gone and rotting in his tomb before he lifted a finger. He was probably still alive when word was brought to him that he was dying. And he made sure everybody knew that. Now, as I think I've demonstrated in my previous video on Libra, Lazarus is Eliezer ben Boethus the Younger, and he comes from a prominent family that had produced several high priests. And Jesus knew that by resurrecting someone of such high profile, the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem would have to murder him because they knew all along he was the Son of God. That's a dirty little secret. These are smart people. You know, like the theologians that I know are lying about homosexual in the Bible. If it were just you or some guy on the street, I'd be like, well, but you're a theologian, you know better. These people knew better. He was a threat to their power. But whereas before there was plausible deniability, that was no longer true. That's another reason why I think the resurrection story of the widow of Nain in Luke is secret Mark in disguise, because I don't think, happy to be wrong, but I don't think he would have done something that spectacular at that stage in his ministry. He's still playing games with the higher authorities. And this is why the rich young man goes unnamed in the Gospel of Mark, as well as Matthew and Luke, which demonstrates to me that they were written before the temple was destroyed. Contrary to what most scholars say today, the Jewish leaders still had their power. And by mentioning Lazarus' name explicitly, you probably got the death penalty. But by the time John was written, the temple was long gone. That had long since stopped being a problem. Mark, on the other hand, is explaining to us psychologically and theologically why this is the point of no return. At the same time, he protects himself and Christians under Jewish rule by hiding the identities of the identities, both here in Scorpio and then later in the Gospel, as you will see. They're a certain person, a certain woman, you'll see a certain fella. The bull is supposed to be slain. Lazarus is supposed to suffer the fate of all mankind. He's supposed to die. But Jesus does not allow that. Therefore, there is a debt to be paid. And on their wedding night, which is an obvious rapture, like we see with Mithras and the bull, Jesus formally accepts that obligation on Lazarus' behalf and on our own. And when he does, just like in John, it's a point of no return. Now, like I said earlier in the video, there's some kind of primordial connection between sex and death and, therefore, life. Connection that has been acknowledged for millennia. It's not something that I'm making up. And it was the physical union between these two men that sealed the deal. I don't know how. That's ultimately why people thought Lazarus was immortal. I would not be the least bit surprised if he were still alive. Thus it makes sense right before we go into secret Mark, that Jesus told his followers that he's going to be executed. He's going to be handed over to the Gentile leaders to be mocked and murdered. But he is God, therefore undying, and he will rise again. And he will take us with him. We will rise with him. Hallelujah. Now, as I said in the beginning, it's fitting that I call this video series Boot Camp for Saints. I think it's the Holy Spirit talking. Again, it's not my place to tell you. As it turns out, the evangelist Mark was using something that was at the time a new psychological technology created explicitly to unify the personality of Roman soldiers so that they would face death bravely. who of course went through a boot camp to train their bodies, just like they went through this boot camp, and we go through this boot camp, and I'm going through this boot camp along with you to train our souls. But Secret Mark doesn't come to us in a vacuum. It has a context because it comes wrapped in a letter from the church father Clement of Alexandria to a man named Theodore. So I'm going to read you this letter. And you will see that everything I told you in this video lines up perfectly with what Clement of Alexandria is saying in this letter, with one exception. The wedding chamber of Jesus and Lazarus, their wedding, their marriage, their sexual union. But keep this in mind. Clement admits in this letter that it's okay to lie to keep this stuff a secret to the uninitiated. And Theodore is uninitiated. I agree with Clement, by the way. This is not a bad thing. This connection between the Gospel of Mark and the Mithras mystery school explains why the school would disappear later in Roman history. Yeah, we shoved it off the cliff, but it was already, if it weren't already weak, we wouldn't have been able to do that. Just as Jesus fulfilled the law of Moses, and we have the new covenant, the church had more than adequately fulfilled the psychological mission of the cult of Mithras, and it had expanded its scope to a dramatically larger population. It included women, it included young people, slaves, although some of the slaves participated in some of the mysteries. This is an aspect of the Catholic Church that we Protestants need to show more respect for. There's a lot of weird stuff that they do that seems like, that ain't Christian. You know, why do you have all these philosophy books? What's it with you and philosophy? Well, C.G. Young commented on several occasions that he rarely ever had a Catholic patient. Most of his patients were Protestants and Jews and atheists. I think we should take the hint. From the letters of the Most Holy Clement, author of Stromates, to Theodore. You did well in silencing the unspeakable teachings of the Carpocratians, for these are the wandering stars referred to in the prophecy, who wander from the narrow road of the commandments into a boundless abyss of the carnal and bodily sins. For priding themselves in knowledge, as they say, of the deep things of Satan, they do not know that they are casting themselves away into the netherworld of the darkness of falsity. In boasting that they are free, they become slaves of servile desires. The deep things, the bythos, I don't know if that's a term they use here. No, they're not using that term. Yeah, batheon. The depths of the psyche. Don't confuse your psychology for your theology. Such men are to be opposed in all ways and altogether. Here we go. For even if they should say something true, one who loves the truth should not even so agree with them. For not all true things are the truth, nor should that truth which merely seems true according to the human opinions be preferred to the true truth, that according to the faith. Now, of the things they keep saying about the divinely inspired gospel according to Mark, some are altogether falsifications. And others, even if they do contain some true elements, nevertheless are not reported truly. For the true things being mixed with inventions are falsified, so that as the saying goes, even the salt loses its savor. Now, you take a vow, take an oath, you tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Satan takes true things as a kernel and wraps tissues of lies around it. This is how you have to evaluate what people are telling you. Just because something they told you is true doesn't mean they're telling you the truth. Clement is not making this up. As for Mark, then, during Peter's stay in Rome, he wrote an account of the Lord's doings, not, however, declaring all of them, nor yet hinting at the mystic ones or secret ones, but selecting what he thought most useful for increasing the faith of those who were being instructed. But when Peter died a martyr, Mark came over to Alexandria, bringing both his own notes and those of Peter, from which he transferred to his former book the things suitable to those studies which make for progress toward knowledge. Thus he composed a more spiritual gospel for those who are being perfected, teleumenon, telos, a goal. Now, in Deuteronomy, translators of the King James Bible lied to you. Let there be no Kadeshah among the daughters of Israel. Let there be no Kadesh among the sons of Israel. These are cult prostitutes, and they lied to you. They said, let there be no whores among the daughter of Israel. Let there be no sodomites among the sons of Israel. Now, the Catholics are a little bit more honest. Let there be no whores. Let there be no whoremongers. Now, the Septuagint adds a line. Let there be no telesphoros among the daughters of Israel. Let there be no telekomenos among the sons of Israel. Teleus. It's about cult prostitutes. And they said it's about homosexuals, and they lied. Nevertheless, he did not divulge the things not to be uttered, nor did he write down the heraphetic teachings of the Lord. But of the stories already written, he added yet others, and moreover, brought in certain traditions or sayings, of which he knew the interpretation would, as a mystagogue, lead the hearers into the innermost sanctuary of that truth hidden by 7 veils. 7 veils, 7 planets, the sun and the moon are included. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They didn't know about Uranus and Neptune. Of course, they didn't know anything about Pluto. Okay? Everything I told you in the video matches up to this, with this one exception. Also, as I've talked about several times in the video, and as Reverend Darlison talks about, Luke seems to have a shorter version of Mark in front of him. Both Luke and Matthew quote from Mark, or maybe Mark's quoting from Matthew, because they seem to be switching notes. But, this confirms, Luke obviously never talked to any of these initiates. Thus in sum, he prepared matters neither grudgingly nor incautiously, in my opinion. And dying, he left his composition to the church in Alexandria, where it even yet is being securely kept, or most perfectly honored, or perhaps unerringly appropriated. Morton Smith, who discovered it, most carefully guarded. Being read only to those who are being initiated into the great mysteries. Again, apparently none of them talked to Luke. But since the foul demons are always devising destruction for the race of men, Carpocrates, instructed by them and using most deceitful arts, so enslaved a certain presbyter of the church in Alexandria, that he got from him a copy of the mystic gospel or secret gospel, which he both interpreted according to his blasphemous and carnal doctrine and, moreover, polluted, mixing with the spotless and holy words utterly shameless lies. For this mixture is drawn off the teachings of the Carpocratians. To them, therefore, as I said above, one must never give way, nor, when they put forth their falsifications, should one concede that it is Mark's mystic gospel, or that the secret gospel is by Mark. Different translation possibilities here. But should even deny it on oath, for not all true things are to be said to all men. For this reason the wisdom of God through Solomon advises, answer the fool from his folly, teaching that the light of the truth should be hidden from those who are mentally blind. This is true psychologically as well. People bring me dreams. I don't always tell you what I'm pulling from your dream, because you're not ready. Again, it says, from him who has not shall be taken away, and let the fool walk in darkness. But we are children of light, having been illuminated by the dayspring of the Spirit from the Lord on high. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, it says, there is liberty, for all things are pure to the pure. To you, therefore, I shall not hesitate to answer the questions you have asked, refuting the falsifications by the very words of the gospel, which I don't think he's going to completely do, because he's not an initiate. He reads the secret mark, the bridal chamber section, but naked man with naked man and other things about which he wrote are not found. Well, yeah, they're not wrote in there. Well, that doesn't mean they're not true. But many other things about which you wrote both seem to be and are falsifications. Now the true explanation and that which accords with the true philosophy, etc., which apparently we've lost, well, we have. We don't have the rest of that. I think it's interesting that Clement uses the term children of light when he's talking about secret Mark. This confirms that the young man here and Lazarus are the same person. Children of light is only used in the Gospels of Luke and John. And of course, it's in John that Lazarus is explicitly named. The term is also used by Paul in his epistles to the Ephesians and the Thessalonians. Now, I talk about this real quick much more extensively in the Libra book, but the Boethius family seems to be associated with the Essenes. These are the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay? And this is an Essene term. So since I think Eleazar, after his resurrection, wrote the Gospel of John, it's not a surprise that it should be in the Gospel of John. Now, Eleazar, as I said, seems to have been pulling from the Gospel of Luke, and in turn, he was the source for the infancy narrative in Luke, the stories of Jesus when he was a baby, and when he was 12 years old in the temple. Didn't you know you would find me in my Father's house? He's the source for those. So obviously we have a feedback going on between Luke and John. We also have a feedback going on between Matthew and Mark, which is why Matthew has longer Mark. The only Mark Luke has is the Mark that we have. And the one exception, so he doesn't have longer Mark, but he does seem to have some version of the secret Mark, that's the widow at Nain. Okay? Now at this stage, I think Mark is reacting to Luke, which means Luke came first. He runs away from the gay, and Luke is pro-gay big time. Luke, in turn, had somehow gotten hold of a version of secret Mark, although I don't know if he actually read it. He might have gotten it from a trusted source who'd already done the translating for him. I don't see any reason why it's anyone other than Eliezer himself, because he would want the world to know about this, even if he had to couch everything in more delicate language. He would also know about that obscure reference to Ereshkigal and Inazu, so he would know to swap this from a brother and sister to mother and son. And finally, John, or shall we say Ephes, or Eliezer, lived in Ephesus. He died there, and Paul wrote his letters to the Ephesians who are in Ephesus. Now, my model of how the Gospel of Mark was organized and why has stood up to some pretty tough stress testing. I'm very proud of it. Now, real quick and dirty on the Kabbalists. Don't waste your time on them, unless you're studying medieval Spain, in which case they're going to be very interesting. How is this a body blow to them? Well, it's very simple. They elevate the masculine and the feminine to the level of the divine. Well, Jesus says that's bullshit, and I agree. There is no feminine in the divine realm. There's no weakness, no darkness. We don't need to descend anymore into the unconscious, into its inconstancy. We're going to get off that wheel. We will all be men, including our women of faith. And Jesus Christ blazes the trail on that when he moves from woman wisdom in the Old Testament to the male Christ. I have no idea how that's actually going to work after the resurrection, what it's going to look like. I just know that that's what's going to happen. Now, a word about my overall orientation towards anything that I do in any of my videos, and this is important to understand because I say a lot of crazy things. I don't set out to prove anything. Okay, I document my case. That's not the same thing. I follow the threads. I take it as it comes. I let the case build itself. I'm like an archaeologist recovering an ancient temple from the earth. Most importantly, I'm happy to walk away from anything that I'm wrong about. I think it's crazy to double down on the wrong, which is why you see it all the time, because there's a lot of crazy. And that's why I can turn around and do these stress tests on my theories, and they hold up very well, whether we're talking about the Gospel of Mark or the Festus disc over on Crete. There's going to be another stress test in Pisces. That's the last part of the Gospel of Mark. We all know about Pontius Pilate, about how he tried to talk the Jews into releasing Jesus. Well, the Gospels give the definite impression that he knew Jesus was telling the truth, and therefore that he was innocent, and therefore he must have known that the Jews were lying about this, the Jewish leaders. It's very important to understand that. Well, that's why people say that we're lying, that we made this up. This is an anti-Semitic story that we made up. Well, now we know how Pontius Pilate knew. And we know why he went through so much trouble, or potential trouble. A lot of bad things could have come out of this if he kept pushing it. Why he went through so much trouble to get Jesus off the hook. And why at the end of the day, he washed his hands of the whole affair. This blood is not on my hand. He was talking to his soldiers. Speaking of soldiers, next up is Sagittarius, the archer. Bing!